Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining the Northern Arizona Celtic Heritage Society for this virtual Celtic festival. And I also want to thank the Arizona Commission on the Arts, Flagstaff Arts Council, Flagstaff Community Foundation, the City of Flagstaff, and Coconino County for their incredible support on being able to make this possible. My name is Todd Barnell, and I may have actually met some of you at some of the past Celtic festivals that we've had here in Flagstaff. I've done an awful lot of talks on a lot of different types of subjects, usually involving plants or food, but today I'd like to actually talk a little bit about gin. And while Knox prides itself on celebrating the culture and the stories of all the Celtic regions, I do have to actually say right up front, all of the gins that we're going to be looking at today come from either Ireland or Scotland. So I want to start off by apologizing to all of my other Celtic cousins out there that we're not actually having any gins from your areas. First question I should probably address is exactly what is gin? And gin is quite simply a spirit that is flavored with juniper. That's it. That is the sum total of gin. Its name actually comes from Jennifer, which is the Dutch for juniper. And in the United Kingdom and in Ireland, for the very, very many years, it was actually called Madame Geneva, which was eventually shortened to gin. And it's not a coincidence that gin is mostly associated with both the Dutch and the British, because both of those countries were the ones that controlled the spice trade. And gin is definitely a child of that trade. So the thing that we'll actually probably be spending the most of our time actually talking about is going to be the botanicals that are actually included in gin. The thing that makes this spirit so particularly interesting, at least to me, is how so many distillers use so many different types of botanicals in their distillation process. And that's one of the things that we'll actually be looking at with these 6 gins today. In addition to juniper, there are some botanicals that are almost always found in gin. And so I just want to kind of start off a little bit by talking about those. The first is coriander. And about 90% of all the gins that are actually out there today include coriander. And interestingly enough, coriander is the aroma that most people actually end up associating with gin. Another one is, or actually it's a group of 3, angelica root, orange peel, or lemon peel. Most gins will actually include some type of a citrus to impart that flavor. And all of the gins that we'll actually be looking at today use one or more of those. The third one is orris root, and that's the chemical star of the entire process. Orris root actually originally was used in the perfume industry, and it is basically a fixer that actually helps aromatic compounds stick. So a lot of different gin distillers will actually use orris root to help with all of those botanicals. Interestingly enough, though, there's several of our gins that we're looking at today that don't use orris root, but instead use a different type. So the first gin that we're going to look at today is Carúm. And Carúm comes from Scotland, and the distillery is actually located on the River Tay, which is in the Cairngorms National Monument, or National Park, excuse me. It's actually very near Cromdale, and that was the site of one of the last battles of the Jacobite Rebellion. And a little over 100 years ago, a family actually decided to buy a farm in this particular area, and they set up a still, which was illegal. And they began actually distilling and creating gin. But after a few years of this, they decided to go legit, and they actually went to the authorities and said, hey, we're producing gin. And they became one of the first authorized distilleries actually in Scotland. So one of the claims of fame of Carúm is it involves the distillation process. And Carúm actually uses what is called a copper berry chamber to vapor infuse the botanicals that they actually use. So I should actually say this is one of the things that gin experts can really get into and spend an awful lot of time talking about, is whether or not in the distillation process you are actually doing vapor infusion or whether you were steeping the botanicals. One of the things that is going to be kind of interesting about the gins that we're looking at is, and all of these gins, I should point out, are generally small batch craft gins. And almost all of them actually use both. So we'll actually see something in terms of the vapor infusion and the steeping when it comes to these different botanicals. And Karun, this copper berry chamber that they use, it is the only one left in the world, which is really kind of interesting. And that copper berry chamber was actually originally used in the perfume industry. So again, it's kind of one of those things where perfume and gin, they use an awful lot of the same techniques. This copper berry chamber, I do want to kind of point out one thing that I thought was kind of interesting about it, is the way that it's actually set up is there's 4 different layers of copper. And they lay all the botanicals on these 4 different layers. And then during the distillation process, the vapors are actually moving up, and they move up through all 4 of those chambers, and therefore like grab onto all of those aromatic compounds that are actually in the botanicals. Another thing that I actually find kind of interesting about this distillery that I wanted to share with you is they have an international team of foragers, people who actually go out and collect these botanicals. And 2 of them are actually writers. I've actually read both of their books. The first one is David Winnard from Manchester, England, and the second is Chris Mayer in Chicago, Illinois. And both of them have written books about urban foraging. This is kind of the thing that they do. And so they both actually work for this distillery and collect these botanicals from all over the world. And the other kind of cool thing about that is they also have a network across the globe of bartenders. And they will stay in touch with these bartenders who are constantly experimenting with this particular gin in different types of cocktails and letting them know what works, what doesn't work. And I actually met one of those bartenders, which is when I first actually found out about this gin, when I was out on a work trip. So before I move on to the next gin, I want to go ahead and tell you a little bit some of the different botanicals that you'll actually find in this one. And one of the things that I'll do is at the end of introducing each one of these gins, I'll take a moment, read you the different botanicals that you'll find, and perhaps that will give you a chance to go ahead and sip a little bit if you're lucky enough to have one of these gins right now while you're watching this. So the different botanicals that you'll find here are rowan berries, bog myrtle, heather, dandelion leaf, and my particular favorite, cowl blush apples, which is an heirloom apple actually from Scotland. So let me move on to our next gin that we're going to be looking at. This is Dingle from County Kerry in Ireland. And it has kind of an interesting beginning. There was 3 friends in Ireland who started one of Ireland's very first microbreweries for beer back in the 1990s. And that took off, and they decided that they would actually set up a distillery as well. And one of the first things they decided to go ahead and start making was gin. And the thing that they wanted to do with this gin is they wanted to actually find botanicals that would highlight that coastal region of Ireland. And so they really focused on looking for some particular botanicals and plants that would sort of capture that overall atmosphere. And they also decided to create a particular process to them that allowed them to first take some of the botanicals, like the traditional botanicals, like we were talking about earlier, the juniper, coriander, and angelica root, and they would actually steep those in the spirit as they were doing the initial distillation process. And then later, they would actually vapor infuse the botanicals that they were adding through small little mesh beds, basically, inside of the still that they had actually built. And they also only make this gin using the water that they actually pump up from over 200 feet below their distillery. So one of the main reasons why they actually chose this particular location was they had access to some extremely pure water. The botanicals, I'll mention this right up front here on this one. The botanicals that they actually chose to sort of highlight this particular section of Ireland is rowan berries, bog myrtle, heather, and chervil. And I do have to say, when I was actually tasting this for the first time, one of the things that I really loved, this was actually one of my favorites, that I really loved is that heather really does actually come through rather nicely. So since we're tasting a gin from Ireland here, I want to take a few minutes to mention a slight tangent, which I have a tendency to do when I'm doing these talks in person. But I wanted to mention sloe gin. And that is a completely different animal from the types of gin that we're actually talking about here. But I bring this up because of its connection to Ireland. And sloe gin got a really bad rap in the 80s, justifiably so, because an awful lot of rot gut was actually made during that time period where they were using an awful lot of chemical flavorings. But a sloe gin fizz was the very first drink that my mom actually gave to me. So it's always had kind of a special place in my heart. And the thing that I eventually discovered about sloe gin is that if you have a really good gin made with pure sloe berries, it is an absolute delight, and it's definitely worth investigating. And these sloe berries that are actually put into a sloe gin come from the blackthorn. And in Irish folklore, the blackthorn is known as strafe. And many linguists actually feel that this could actually be the origin of the word strife, because the blackthorn can grow up to 8 feet in height. It has humongous thorns that will just tear you to shreds when you're trying to move through it, and it can actually cause infection. They make fantastic hedgerows, and the wood, which has a beautiful black luster to it, is oftentimes used to make the walking sticks that you'll see show up on an awful lot in Ireland. And that takes us to a little segue in which I want to read a little poem by Seamus Heaney, mainly because I'm Irish, and this is a poem about Seamus Heaney's mom and how she used to make sloe gin in the old cottage industry that's still made actually in Ireland today. So the name of this poem by Seamus Heaney is Sloe Gin. And he writes, "The clear weather of juniper darkened into winter. She fed gin to sloes and sealed the glass container. When I unscrewed it, I smelled the disturbed, tart stillness of a bush rising through the pantry. When I poured it, it had a cutting edge and flamed like Betelgeuse. I drink to you in smoke-merled, blue-black polished sloes, bitter and dependable." So, our third gin that we'll be taking a look at, and I do promise that's the only poetry that I'll actually read on this presentation, but our third one is Edinburgh gin, which is obviously from Edinburgh, Scotland. This is kind of a fun one, especially because I'm here in Flagstaff, Arizona, surrounded by the world's largest ponderosa pine forest, and this gin is actually flavored with pine. It's actually fresh pine buds, and that not only evokes the flavor of Flagstaff to me, but it also makes me think of the forests of central Scotland. And that also makes me think of Edinburgh, which is one of my favorite places in the world, and its connections to medical science. So during what was known as the Scottish Enlightenment, Edinburgh was the place to go if you wanted to study medicine and wanted to become a doctor. In fact, Arthur Conan Doyle actually studied there before he actually became a writer, when he was actually planning on being a doctor. And medicine is where gin actually got its start. The first person to actually make gin was a Dutch doctor, and it was sold as a medicine. And one of the things that I thought was kind of interesting is, if you're at all familiar with Samuel Pepys and his famous London diaries from the 1600s, in one of his diaries he actually wrote what is possibly the oldest ode to gin. This is from his entry in October 10th, 1663. He began his entry talking about an illness that he was having, and then mentioning that he was, quote, "sent some strong water made of juniper. Whether that or anything else of my draught this morning did it, I cannot tell, but I had a couple of stools forced after it. But whether I shall grow better upon it, I cannot tell yet." Subsequently, he actually wrote in his diary that yes, gin had taken care of that particular complaint that he was dealing with. So, our fourth gin is The Botanist. This is from Islay in Scotland, and it is quite unusual in that I've never come across another gin that uses so many botanicals. And I also want to point out that the only one of the traditional things that you would find in gin is coriander. It doesn't have any of the rest of any of the things that you would actually normally find, or excuse me, juniper. It doesn't actually have coriander. Everything that they are actually using in this particular gin, they actually source from around Islay and the other islands around Scotland. And they actually have teams of people who go out and actually wild source all of these botanicals. And what I'm going to do is go ahead and just read off the list of what you'll find if you actually get yourself a bottle of this Botanist. This is what you can actually prepare yourself for. This contains apple mint, chamomile, creeping thistle, downy birch, elder, gorse, hawthorn, heather, lady's bedstraw, lemon balm, meadowsweet, mugwort, red clover, spearmint, sweet cicely, bog myrtle, tansy, watermint, white clover, wild thyme, and wood sage. All of those botanicals are actually found in this, which are all, again, vapor infused during their second distillation process. The fourth one that we're going to be looking at, I want to make sure I got that, and I did, thank goodness, is the Hendrick's Gin. And this is from South Ayrshire in Scotland, from a town called, or village called Girvan. And I have to admit, when I was first tasting these a couple of years ago and doing the research on these different gins, I was a little surprised. This one actually ended up being my favorite. And it's because of kind of an unusual aspect of this one. The master distiller at this particular distillery is a Ms. Leslie Gracie, and she only makes 500 liters of this at a time. And she uses two different stills in the process. One is called the Bennett still, and the other is called the Carter Head still. But the really interesting thing to me is the origin of what she was trying to actually achieve with Hendrick's Gin. And her desire was, can I capture the perfect British garden summer? And so in order to do that, she decided to focus on two different things that she thought of about the perfect summer in a garden. And those were rose bushes and tiny little cucumber sandwiches. So two of the botanicals that are actually put into this, again, vapor infusing them during the process, is rose petals and Scottish grown cucumbers. And I will tell you right now that one of the things that made me fall in love with this gin is after my friend and I were actually tasting all of these, and we then sliced off a very thin little slice of cucumber and had a slice of cucumber and then actually had another sip of this, and it was just spectacular, and it actually made the roses pop. And it really did feel like you were sitting in a beautiful garden in Scotland during the summertime. A couple of the other things that you'll actually find in this, besides roses and cucumbers, is this does contain orris root, caraway seeds, chamomile, elderflower, yarrow, and cupebberry, which is a complete and total oddball, and I had to actually even look into this myself. It's a pepper that is usually used for its oil and fruit, and it's actually grown in Sumatra and Java. So a very unusual little addition to everything else that she was actually trying to achieve with a Scottish garden scene. The last gin that I would like to talk about today, for this one, we find ourselves on the side of a lake deep in rural Ireland in County Leitrim. And this is called Drumshanbo Gunpowder Gin. The name of the distillery is The Shed. And they've taken a very unusual approach with this particular gin, and they come up with a tagline that I think kind of encapsulates their unique approach. Their tagline is Oriental Botanicals, Chinese Tea, and Irish Curiosity. This particular gin is distilled in medieval stills. They're extremely ancient, And they use a very, very slow, gentle steeping approach with most of the botanicals, except for the fruits that I'll talk about here and the tea. Those are actually vapor infused at the end. And I'm not exactly sure if maybe this is what kind of like led these distillers to actually start kind of thinking of this, but Drumshambo is actually the location where for the very first East India Company ship, the nails were actually smelted and made in this town in Ireland. So this town in Ireland does have a very long history with the Oriental trade with India and China that was actually going back. And they seem to have really gone for that in spades because this actually contains caraway seed, meadowsweet, cardamom, star anise, Chinese lemons, and they will only use Chinese lemons, Oriental grapefruit, kaffir lime, and then of course the big ingredient in this is gunpowder tea from China. And it does, I will tell you, make a very interesting, interesting gin that I think you'll definitely want to actually try out sometime. So with that, I want to thank all of you very much for joining me today. And I hope that you can actually catch some of the other amazing things that Knox is actually doing to bring all of us together virtually during these difficult times and to celebrate our Celtic heritage. So thank you very much.